Is a decades-long alliance under threat? Will a missing Saudi journalist fracture Riyadh's relationship with Washington? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is US-Saudi ties. The disappearance and suspected murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi has led to more pressure for the United States to reassess its relationship with Saudi Arabia. US President Donald Trump has expressed concerns over Khashoggi's whereabouts. Riyadh insists he safely left the consulate here in Istanbul last week, but American officials are urging a transparent investigation into what happened to him. The incident is the latest strain between the US and Saudi Arabia after Trump's claims earlier this month that King Salman wouldn't remain in power for 2 weeks without US support. Is that accurate? If the US reconsiders its alliance, what impact would that have on the kingdom? Shoaib Hassan reports.
A mysterious disappearance has become big news all around the world. The whereabouts of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, a critic of Riyadh's current leadership, remains unknown a week after he walked into his country's consulate in Istanbul. Turkish authorities fear he's been murdered, but it's comments from their strong ally, the United States, that might worry the Saudis the most.
I am concerned about it. I don't like hearing about it. And hopefully that will sort itself out. Right now, nobody knows anything about it, but there's some pretty bad stories going around. I do not like it.
It's the latest strain on the alliance between the House of Saud and the White House. This strong relationship has been a constant in the Middle East and the Islamic world for more than 80 years. Critics say Washington has turned a blind eye to Riyadh's repression at home and financing of terror groups and repressive governments in return for the flow of cheap oil. That relationship appears to have strengthened during the Trump administration as it imposes sanctions against Saudi rival Iran. But disputes over the price of oil have led to blunt remarks from the US president.
And I love the king, King Solomon, but I said, King, we're protecting you. You might not be there for 2 weeks without us. You have to pay for your military.
He made the remarks as his administration pressures Saudi Arabia to increase oil production and decrease prices ahead of November's congressional elections in the US. The Saudis have since increased their output. But with the US now weighing in over Khashoggi, is it a sign that Washington's view on the Saudi leadership is changing? Or is it merely lip service that won't have any impact on their relationship? Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Riyadh is Ahmed Al Ibrahim, who's a specialist in Saudi affairs. In Philadelphia, we have Michael Johns. He's the co-founder of the Tea Party movement and a former speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush. And Ali Al-Ahmed is in Washington, D.C. He's the director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Ahmed Al Ibrahim, it's been quite a period of time for Saudi Arabia, especially in the international eye. Is it a difficult time defending your government?
Not really. I mean, everything, the facts are there and the record is there. You know, Saudi Arabia is always going to be attacked. So before women driving and before all the human rights and before we ticked everything else, you know, we've been bashed. So we are ticking all the boxes and we still. So if we have churches, synagogues, if we have the biggest club, if we have Johnny Walker comes alive in Mecca, still we're going to be bashed from each and every country out there. So this is standard. But what we're doing is if we're talking about the latest Trump statements, you know, President Trump has bashed everyone, basically every leader around the world. We know what he's doing. We understand what he's doing. He's trying to gain some power on his ground. However, you know, touching the royal family, touching the king statue, especially when it's not right. You know, we're paying premium price for our jets. We're paying premium price for our missiles, for our bullets. I mean, you know, we buy the F-15s for $230 million, and whereas Israel is buying it for $90 million. So we know what we're doing. They cannot do that. If Mr. Trump is trying to say we are defending Saudi Arabia, he's not defending Saudi Arabia per se, because Saudi Arabia does not need anyone to defend its land. But on the contrary, they're defending their assets, which is oil on the ground.
Ahmed, you've given us a lot here. Now, let me come in here for a second. Now, undoubtedly, we're looking at the US-Saudi relationship here. And at the beginning of all of this, one of the main focal points of it was going to be, and still is, President Trump saying that Saudi Arabia would not survive for 2 weeks without US military support, right? You mentioned that as well. And, you know, whenever he mentions King Salman, he pronounces it King Solomon as well, which is a little interesting little quirk of it as well. Now, in the past few days, the disappearance and possible killing of Jamal Khashoggi, right? We have senior US senators like Lindsey Graham saying if this is true, there will be a heavy price to be paid economically, politically, and otherwise. We have the Vice President, Mike Pence, also coming out and saying if this is true, this is big and this is a problem. President Trump himself is worried about this. So let's fold this in. This is the latest flashpoint where if it's true that a journalist, somebody who criticized your government, was actually killed within the grounds of the embassy in Istanbul, is this going to be the red line? Is this the end of your relationship with the United States? And how do you feel about that?
Well, definitely, Jamal Khashoggi never bashed his own government and his own leader. He was talking, he has his own views about human rights, how it's been handled in Saudi Arabia. You know, we cannot satisfy, or the government cannot satisfy anyone. However, you just mentioned the killing of Khashoggi in Istanbul. This is not even confirmed. Probably within a day or two, Istanbul is gonna maybe, or Ankara or Turkey is gonna basically decide what's happened to Jamal. It's on her sovereign, land. Jamal Khashoggi, according to the embassy, to the consulate, he went in and he went out. Out of the premises of the embassy, yes, Saudi Arabia is responsible for their citizen, and that's why Saudi Arabia is working with the Turkish Authority in order to find Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi citizen, that he is not actually bash his government or he talks about of the king or anything. If you go and you check his tweets, he keeps basically retweeting things about what's the initiative of Crown Prince. He always say positive things. He take from the local news and he retweets it. I mean, study Jamal Khashoggi very well before we issue a very critical statement that he's against of the Saudi government. His family is here. His son is here. His extended family is all of them here.
I think we're on a bit of a diversion here, Ahmed. Ahmed, we can disagree to the...
It's not diversion, it's facts.
We can disagree.
It's facts.
We can look at the variability of his statements about whether he criticizes the crown or not, right? Ultimately, here's a man, he's in America because he said he fears for his safety. Or he was in America and then he was in Istanbul. But nevertheless, the actual fate of the man is under question, and we take it very seriously. Yes, it's unconfirmed. The actual fate of the man is under question. We do not know for sure, but there's a strong suggestion, and we have sources within Turkish police and within the Interior Ministry who are saying that the man was quite likely killed within the embassy grounds. So I'm going to ask you the question again before I move on to my other guests. If this is true, is this the end of your relationship with the United States? Would you accept that?
I don't think it's going to be true. And the relationship with the United States that is not defined by somebody who has no relation to the United States. It's like Saudi Arabia cutting relation with the United States because of John Snowden. I mean, who cares about John Snowden? We don't interfere in anybody's business. However, we still don't have an affirmative between the Saudi intelligence and the Turkish intelligence what happened or what's the destiny of Jamal Khashoggi. We hope he's alive. We hope he's going to come out soon. The only people who basically was hammering the story about him getting killed is the state of Qatar. So you take it and you fly with it. They did so many tweets online from Al Jazeera and they deleted it. So I'm going to leave you with that and you can take it.
We can talk about tens of thousands of Saudi trolls who were also saying he deserved to be killed and dismembered. So we don't want to go down into that. No. We don't want to go down into that. Because if we want to use Twitter as a litmus test.
No problem.
If we want to use Twitter as a litmus test.
What you're speculating and you're assuming the guy is dead and you're putting it to Saudi Arabia and telling me about the relationship between Saudi Arabia and America. You cannot base on a fallacy.
You're saying the Qataris are amplifying it. Ahmed, you're saying the Qataris are amplifying it using Twitter.
Absolutely.
Using Twitter as your reference point. If we had to use Twitter as a reference point, we have to include the tens of thousands of Saudi supporters who are saying, you know what? we killed him and he deserved it. So let's not go down that rabbit hole. Let me bring in Michael Johns. Michael Johns,
I'm talking about Al Jazeera, about the establishment.
Okay, Al Jazeera, the establishment.
Okay.
Michael Johns, let's come in.
You can go on.
Are we in a unique phase of relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I would say in many respects the relationship between the United States and Riyadh has strengthened on President Trump's watch. I mean, he had an immensely successful visit in 2017. We had, I think, the largest arms deal in the history of the world between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. We're much more aligned with concerns to Iranian-sponsored terrorism in the region. And yet, of course, as has always been the case, there remain issues that are troubling. Human rights is always historically been one of those. But I'm reminded when FDR first initiated his relationship with the House of Saud, he said, "We're not here to lecture." President Trump more or less repeated that message during his 2017 visit. And I think the focus of American foreign policy towards Saudi Arabia is appropriately on what is a hugely important strategic relationship, a hugely important economic relationship, and one that in the ideal world is going to continue to strengthen.
Michael, is it going to fly if there's confirmation, again, if Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, if we have confirmation that he was murdered within the grounds of the embassy, is that going to fly? Or we're not here to lecture them on human rights, let them do what they want to?
No, I think that would be, if he was killed in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul, that would be immensely troubling to the United States of America, and it would be clearly a setback in our relationship. I do think we can stipulate that we don't know what happened, but I think we also can stipulate with a certain degree of certainty that we know he entered that embassy and we know he didn't come out of it, and we know he's missing. So I think it spells trouble, and I would only say that this is a man who wrote for the Washington Post and American media. He had a presence in the United States, and I think the singular worst thing you can do with this administration, the Trump administration, for the purposes of relationships is to interfere or mess with individuals that either are Americans or associated with the United States of America. So I'm hopeful that this turns out to be not as troubling as some of the signs indicate.
Right.
But I acknowledge that I think you have a great degree of unanswered questions here with a man that clearly was no friend.
Lots of unanswered questions.
Ali
Al Ahmed, you've been shaking your head quite vociferously, especially when Ahmed El Ibrahim has been speaking. Tell me why.
No, I was shaking my head at your guest in Pennsylvania.
My apologies.
I think we have been the narrative that the U.S. cares about human rights in Saudi Arabia is false. It doesn't. I've been in Washington for the past 18 years. I meet with American officials from the time of Clinton until now, and although publicly they state they care and they're concerned, some of their actually statements is bigoted because they start talking about themselves, not the victims of human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia. Very simple fact that the U.S. government spent $0 to promote human rights in Saudi Arabia in 50 years. Secondly, the U.S. government administrations never called on Saudi Arabia to have elections. In fact, the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, in 2015, endorsed Saudi municipal elections, which excluded women. This is like apartheid elections, and these elections were not for anything useful. These councils are half elected, and they have no power. So that was always the U.S. official line, which is false, that they care. Because if they did care, women would not, Saudi Arabia would not be the last country in the world to allow women to drive. That American Christians in Saudi Arabia would actually have an opportunity to worship openly. But the U.S. government never cared about human rights in Saudi Arabia, especially for the citizens. Secondly is, I think right now this expression of concern regarding Jamal Khashoggi might not have to do with Jamal Khashoggi. It might have to do with the new position that Mohammed bin Salman is taking, which is more independent from the United States. And that has been the case of the U.S. policy in the region. No matter what you are, if you are an absolute ruler like Mohammed bin Salman, if you are, an elected liberal secular prime minister like Mossadegh in Iran, if you start acting on your own, then we will turn against you. And I think Mohammed bin Salman is starting to build his own.
Let me ask you very directly. 2 weeks. Is Trump right when he says Saudi Arabia will not survive for 2 weeks without U.S. military support or the U.S. military umbrella? Is he right?
This is an exaggeration. He's right in part, meaning that the Saudi security has been always guaranteed by the United States. It used to be the UK against domestic and regional powers. I have to say that, and I experienced this. The U.S. government has worked diligently, and this has been not me. I mean, admitted to me by members of the previous administration that yes, we will stand in your way if you try to change things in Saudi Arabia, because the king and the monarchy is our allies. And that's even you if you are a person who wants to bring in, liberal democracy or liberal rule. And that's the reality. That's the realistic view of the American administrations or regime policy in the region. They don't want countries that are independent, that spends their money on their population. They want countries that they use as a resource to either to sell weapons or to use as proxies in the region. And Mohammed bin Salman, I think he's changing that right now. He's probably want to fly on his own.
Okay, so Ahmed Al Ibrahim, I know you and Ali Al Ahmed don't agree on much, but would you agree with him on this, that Mohammed bin Salman is shifting the dial a little bit and the Americans don't like it? That's why President Trump is resorting to saying things like, you're not going to survive without us, be careful.
Absolutely, Mohammed bin Salman is aligned with everything that we want and where he's taking the ship and taking it to an advanced level. Look at all the, I would say, the good social human rights event that has actually been hitting the countries. I know for a fact with the private circles of President Trump, he is really, he always make Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman as an example on how he is decisive in making measures and taking the ship in a very fast speed. Definitely, he's going to the right way. But again, not everything is perfection within this country in Saudi Arabia. There is mistakes. Mistakes come back and solve. This is the first administration that comes into Saudi Arabia or King and Crown Prince where they make decisions and they test it. And if it doesn't work with the society, they take it back. So I think we're taking everything. But the challenges for Saudi Arabia is so huge. We are in a war with Yemen. We have Iraq in the north. We have Syria. We have Egypt. We have a lot of countries that we are taking care of. We have Iran, and we have all the other issues that, regional intelligence, they had to infiltrate within Saudi Arabia. This is a lot on one country, and we are also developing ourselves. So how much can you ask from the Crown Prince or the King to do while you have all these challenges? I mean, give me another country, they have the same challenges that Saudi Arabia has.
Okay, Ali Al Ahmed, do you accept that argument that the Saudis are in a defensive position in the region? They've got all of these challenges that they're dealing with. They've got a lot on their plate.
I mean, they do have a lot on their plate, but I think it's due to their policy. I mean, they have been allied with the United States, and they were involved in several wars, and regional wars against Iraq, for example, and the campaign against Iran that's been going on, and cost Saudi Arabia trillions of dollars probably. And now with the Yemen war and other like in the Saudi involvement with Egypt and then with Syria, the Saudis would have been better off if they had made these deals with their regions. It would be cheaper. Somebody said very smart thing the other day, said like, if the Saudis made a deal with the Iranians, they don't have to pay the Americans $400 billion. They would save a lot of money. They use that money in their country, but that will not make the US happy. I think there is a Western mindset that we need to keep these people fighting so we can sell them more weapons. Okay. We don't sell them things good for their country.
So let me ask Michael John. Michael Johns, is that fair?
So
Michael Johns, is that
just to interfere?
Hold on, Ahmed. Just for a second, Ahmed. Just a second. Michael Johns, is that fair? Divide and rule, a kind of imperial mindset. Let's get the Iranians and the Saudis to keep on fighting each other. Let's not have them have any rapprochement, so that we can have an influence in the region. Is that something that's within the thinking, within the White House, within the Pentagon, within the State Department?
I think it's true that a strong and stable Saudi Arabia is crucial given the hostility that Iran has demonstrated throughout that region. I don't think it's a divide and conquer strategy. Our goal is not to conquer. Our goal is to maintain the security and stability of Saudi Arabia. And I think with the withdrawal from the Iran agreement, the strengthening of our relationships with Saudi Arabia, the promising, at least marginally, liberalization steps that have been taken within Saudi Arabia, MBS's acknowledgement of the security threats and the importance of the U.S. relationship should all be viewed as encouraging signs. And yet, we're not under any illusions that this is some flourishing Jeffersonian democracy. I think it's simply an acknowledgement that we understand, and this president correctly understands, that there are some inherent limitations to what the U.S. can do. And our track record there is not very good, by the way, in forging human rights changes abroad. 1979 in Iran is maybe one of the better examples when we isolated the Shah of Iran only over human rights issues alone, only to see the emergence of a regime that was not just worse from the standpoint of their relationship with the U.S., but even more egregious in their violations of human rights. Same could be said of Nicaragua in 1979.
It was that time when the Shah started to go independent.
Okay, well, and this is interesting. And you know what? I would love to have this conversation about that, but it's almost a different discussion. Whether pushing for human rights created something worse, maybe we can have both of you back on to discuss that in the future. Ahmed El Ibrahim, you wanted to jump in. I want to be fair to you. Go ahead. We're almost wrapping up. Go ahead, Ahmed.
Okay, but for Ali Ahmed, saying that Saudi Arabia went to war, the United States went to war, went with Vietnam, with Somalia, with Iraq, with Afghanistan. You have a lot of special forces missions coming and back forth. So everybody is trying to, so everybody is trying to protect their interests. So who paid for it? The American taxpayers pay for it. For us, we are paying for it, and we have to secure our border against Iran. It's very simple. We are very transparent. We are part of the world community. We are not isolated. We're not sanctioned by 1 million, and we have the people on hunger, and the government actually, infiltrate morphine, afune, and drugs to the people. So anyway, I'm not going to go touch that. But at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia knows what's best for them. And Saudi Arabia is allied with the U.S. politics. And they are doing things together to have a better region, terrorist-free, stop money laundering, stop financing Daesh, stop financing Al-Qaeda, to have a better world. If this is a problem for the international community, I don't know what else Saudi Arabia can do. And one more thing, as much as we love America and the American people, Saudi Arabia, you have to understand, they can stand on their feet and they don't need anybody simply.
Okay. Well, you know what? You all came from very different perspectives here. But one thing I think you can all agree on is that there's so much at stake, hundreds of billions of dollars in arms deals, oil, and so forth, that it doesn't look likely that a breakup is imminent at any point in time in the near future. However, there might be some cracks and there might be some strains, and this is why it's fascinating, and we'll continue to watch the US-Saudi relationship. And of course, we will continue to monitor the situation to find out the fate of Jamal Khashoggi, and we hope that he shows up alive at some point in time. But with every passing day,
we all hope.
That hope diminishes, and there will be massive questions that Saudi Arabia has to answer for with regards to that. But for the moment, gentlemen, thank you very much. Ahmed El Ibrahim, Michael Johns, and Ali Al Ahmed. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come, new Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh is sworn in despite sexual misconduct allegations. Should he have been confirmed in the first place? And could it end up helping the Democrats in the midterm elections? And Cameroon counts the votes from their presidential election. Will Africa's longest reigning leader, Paul Biya, be re-elected for another term? And could it trigger more violence?
On behalf of our nation, I want to apologize to Brett and the entire Kavanaugh family for the terrible pain and suffering you have been forced to endure. Those who step forward to serve our country deserve a fair and dignified evaluation, not a campaign of political and personal destruction based on lies and deception.
It was a contentious confirmation. Brett Kavanaugh has been sworn in as the latest U.S. Supreme Court justice, despite massive opposition, particularly stemming from multiple allegations of past sexual misconduct. A divided Senate narrowly confirmed him over the weekend after a turbulent hearing. An FBI report concluded there wasn't enough evidence to back up a sex assault claim by Professor Christine Blasey Ford against Kavanaugh. It's being seen as a major victory for Donald Trump, who's effectively stacked the country's highest court in favor of conservatives. But some strategists say the backlash could actually propel Democrats into office in the upcoming midterm elections. Interesting times. Well, to discuss this, we're joined from Washington by John Malcolm, who is the Senior Vice President of the Institute for Constitutional Government, as well as our former Deputy Assistant Attorney General. And also in Washington, D.C., we have Anisha Singh. She's the Senior Organizing Director of the Generation Progress Team at the Center for American Progress. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Anisha, let me begin with you. First of all, do you accept the confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh now? And do you respect the apology from the president to Kavanaugh and his family for this process?
I think it was extremely disrespectful for the president to apologize on behalf of the entire country when we know survivors of sexual assault and sexual violence have come forward bravely and courageously across this country, coming to Washington, D.C., and sometimes speaking for the first time ever about their own trauma, reliving their trauma, and to completely disregard that trauma and say that, you know, what Kavanaugh went through was shameful and unacceptable, and ignoring what Dr. Blasey Ford went through and what survivors have had to go through watching this process. I mean, it's completely disrespectful. And to think that, you know, from day one, this entire process, whether it's the hearing, the first hearing, the second hearing, the FBI investigation, norms and precedent have been violated and pushed aside to push this nominee through to confirmation without allowing a thorough investigation, without allowing a thorough hearing with respectful witnesses and experts of trauma to come forward to make sure that every stone was turned. So this entire process has just been completely frustrating for a lot of us who were watching.
Right. So a lot of stuff to tackle here. John Malcolm, disrespectful, disregarding the trauma of many people, and also another claim by Anisha, the fact that the executive is fiddling with the process, the executive branch is fiddling with this entire process. Does any of that check out in your opinion?
Well, I don't know what that means to say that the executive is fiddling with the process. The president nominated somebody. The Senate had its advice and consent rule. It was messy, to say the least. I think it is just wrong to say that survivors are not listened to. I think that, of course, every survivor should be listened to. That doesn't mean that their word should be taken at face value without any attempt to corroborate that information. In this case, the Senate and the FBI conducted an investigation, and there was no corroborating information to support the claims of Dr. Ford or Debbie Ramirez or Julie Swetnick. It does not mean that people are somehow not believing of survivors or disrespectful of survivors. After all, there have been rape convictions in which survivors, or, you know, somebody said, and I believe that they were raped. This is the person who raped me, and they've been convicted. And DNA evidence has come along and exonerated those people. So occasionally, people do have things happen to them. Nobody is questioning that Dr. Ford was somehow not molested. She was just not correct, or at least not corroborated, as to the attacker. That we still do have due process in this country. We still do have a presumption of innocence. A thorough investigation was done, and Judge Kavanaugh has now become Justice Kavanaugh, I think correctly so.
Anisha, the system is robust. You went through the process, and this is what we have right now. We have a new Supreme Court justice. It was messy, as John said, and we are where we are now after all that messiness. The evidence didn't meet the scale of the accusations. Go ahead.
The evidence did not meet the scale because all the evidence was not presented. We had 1 week for the FBI to investigate. With a limited scope, certain witnesses were not allowed to be interviewed, and the FBI did not reach out to certain witnesses, including Dr. Blasey Ford herself. We had an individual who was Kavanaugh's roommate who came forward and said that he has lied under oath about his drunken behavior and his lifestyle during college. And I'm here to talk about that. He was not questioned. There's so many individuals that we were hoping would have been questioned to make sure that this was a thorough process, and yet it was jammed through. A week was given, limited scope, and so we don't have all that information. So all of the unanswered questions, especially that is being brought up by John right now, whether or not it was Kavanaugh who Dr. Ford is remembering, all of those questions cannot properly be answered without those witnesses being questioned, without all of the evidence. And so to say that is one thing. And then we also learned so much during his testimony itself, just looking at his temperament, right? Looking at Kavanaugh's temperament throughout the process, the way he was politically attacking the left, the Clintons were brought up. What is his judicial temperament? Can he be
okay, that's an interesting point.
Fair and independent? Okay,
so I think if we can all agree on the fact that we're not going to get any sort of agreement here on whether there was a sexual assault or not, or whether there was a proper process to determine that. Let's move to his temperament. John, would you agree then with Anisha that an interesting subplot spun out of this, that in the way he was defending himself by almost claiming a conspiracy against him, mentioning the Clintons, railing against the left, is that the sort of impartial Supreme Court justice you want at the table, making some of the most fundamental decisions that decide the future of the nation?
Sure. Well, first of all, every person who was supposedly a witness to the events in question was, in fact, interviewed. With respect to Justice Kavanaugh's temperament, we don't need to guess about that. He has been a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals for the last dozen years. The American Bar Association, hardly a bastion of conservative legal thought, interviewed well over 100 of his fellow judges and litigants who have appeared before him many, many times, all of whom said he has an outstanding judicial temperament. Yes, he was hot under the collar when he was responding to Dr. Ford and the other allegations that had been made against him. And my God, the man was accused of spiking drinks and facilitating the gang rape of women. And my strong suspicion is that if he had behaved in a robot-like, calm manner, perhaps befitting of a judge on the bench, that the response would have been, well, surely he must be guilty, because anybody who would be responding to allegations of this nature would be righteously indignant. And the fact that he was calm indicates that surely he must have done the things about which he was accused.
John,
so Brett Kavanaugh was damned if he did, and damned if he didn't.
That's interesting. Given that you bring up a hypothetical, I don't like to ask hypothetical questions, but given that you brought up a hypothetical, if it was the other way around and we had a nominee, somebody in the vetting process, somebody in the spotlight, railing against the Koch brothers and Fox News and conservative media being out to get him, would you trust that judge and not think, oh, maybe this person's a bit too ideological to be a Supreme Court justice? You'd think that, wouldn't you?
I would look at the entirety of their record and I would see what they were responding to. So, for instance, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg made some rather intemperate comments about President Trump before he was elected, I haven't gone and, people question whether she'd have to recuse herself from cases involving the administration. I don't question Justice Ginsburg's integrity or her ability to sit as a judge. So, yes, I think you'd have to look at the circumstances under which those comments were made.
Okay, Anisha, Justice Ginsburg's left bent is just the same as Kavanaugh's right bent.
Kavanaugh was not sitting on the Supreme Court when he was making those comments. He was still being interviewed for a job, and I think that is the context we need to be remembering here. This was a job interview, and no one in their right mind goes into a job interview bashing other people, let's say in the firm or in the company, and talks about the fact that they can get along with everyone after that. He was angry, he was shouting, he was cutting off senators, and he was bringing up the Clintons and other right-wing extremist talking points that were not corroborated. And so that is a huge concern. What cases are going to come forward? And when we're talking about his record, if we're going to say we need to look at his entire record, we were looking at that. This is someone who the president chose because he knows he will fulfill his litmus test, whether that's overturning Roe, dismantling the ACA, or whether it's making sure that the president's protected when and if issues with this Russia investigation come forward. These are all things that we have learned based on his record as well. So there was already a lot of concern about Kavanaugh coming into this second hearing and coming into these sexual allegations.
Is it that simple, John, that the president now has a loyal judge on the right who'll push through whatever he wants?
Absolutely not. Judge Kavanaugh, now Justice Kavanaugh, is a fair-minded, independent jurist who has exhibited that time and time again during his dozen years on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, up to and including writing majority opinions in cases ruling against the Bush administration, even though he served at the right hand of President Bush for many of the years that were in question. There was no litmus test. Brett Kavanaugh was on my list of people who I thought would make outstanding Supreme Court justices. I've never asked him his opinion on the Affordable Care Act or about Roe versus Wade or any of the other parade of horribles that you have just heard about. He will, like any good judge, wait for cases to come before him, consider the arguments of counsel, and will rule according to the law.
Anisha Singh, 2 hashtags. Me Too, that's one, right? And November is coming. November is coming
right.
has been used, in many ways, galvanized by everything we've seen now during this battle. Are the midterms going to be as acrimonious as ever? And tell me what this confirmation means for those who feel Kavanaugh should not be a Supreme Court justice. What's going to happen?
I think one of the most beautiful things that has come out of this horrible, horrifying process is that people are galvanized. People are talking about the Supreme Court that have never talked about the Supreme Court before. People who have never really gotten engaged on this issue of the judiciary, who never really understood that process, got up and were learning about the process, busing in, flying into Washington, D.C., going to their senators' offices, getting involved in that process. And so we have a new cohort of people in the communities that care about this issue, who are galvanized and are outraged and want to see change. And I think people are finally starting to understand how important the courts are and how important elections are to those courts, and realizing that senators and the president have that say in who sits in our court. So I think people are realizing that they need to show up and show out and vote this November, because that is the only way to stop this entrenchment of the conservative majority in our courts.
Oh, and that's interesting because, John, I guess you wouldn't begrudge the kind of rejuvenation of democracy, no matter how it comes about. We're seeing something happening in response to this. Anisha's right, isn't she?
Yeah, actually, except for the last little bit of what Anisha said, I agree with everything that she said. She says that people are going to be galvanized to turn out to stop this parade of horribles that she believes the conservatives are foisting upon the country. That part I disagree with. But in terms of everybody being energized and realizing what a horrible process this was and how important the courts are and realizing that they need to turn out and vote, I agree with all of that. And we'll see how it plays out come November. But certainly people who were thinking about sitting on the sidelines prior to the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings are probably now going to go out and vote. And we'll see where they end up in November.
And the thing that's galvanizing them, just again, John, it's not just someone like Anisha. We even have Senator Elizabeth Warren saying, it hurts every survivor of sexual assault who has been ignored. There are many people, especially many women, who feel aggrieved by this. Is it maybe wise not to just ignore it and say, well, it didn't check out, I'm sorry, you know, Christine Blasey Ford, this wasn't true, and that's the end of that? Or is it worth engaging with what they have to say and what they're upset about?
Oh, look, I would engage with people in the Me Too movement. Let me be clear. I have a son and I have a daughter. And if my daughter came forward and accused somebody of molesting her or sexually assaulting her, I would want that to be thoroughly checked out and her word to be taken seriously. On the other hand, if my son was accused of sexually assaulting somebody, I would also want it to be thoroughly investigated. And if there was not corroboration of that account, I would hope that he would be exonerated and able to get on with his life without this kind of cloud. So yes, Me Too movement needs to be taken seriously. I agree that it is long overdue. On the other hand, people also have a belief in the fairness of process and a presumption of innocence, and have studied all of Judge Kavanaugh's lifelong record and found Dr. Ford's allegations to be wanting in this case. But it has certainly energized people on both sides of the political aisle, and they will turn out in November, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, final word to you, Anisha. We have less than 30 seconds left on this segment.
In order to believe survivors or say that we believe survivors, we need to give survivors the full benefit of doubt and actually listen to the witnesses and listen to all of the evidence that comes forward. That is the exact thing that we had been asking for the entire process. The entire process, it was like pulling teeth to try and get a hearing, to try and get an investigation. Every step of the way, there was trouble and there was a lot that we were up against, and the entire process was a sham. And it's unfortunate, and we can just be hopeful that Judge Kavanaugh is fair and is independent, because lives are at stake. The communities that are trusting the process are at stake. Women are at stake. Healthcare is at stake. Gun rights, everything. You know, this is decades to come. This is a lifetime appointment. So there's a lot at stake here.
Okay, Anisha and John, really enjoyed having you both on the program. Hope you'll come back and join us on the Newsmakers. But for the moment, I have to move on. Thanks again. Cameroon is counting the votes from this Sunday's presidential election that will likely see the return of President Paul Biya for a 7th term. The election was marred by violence in English-speaking regions where unrest has escalated over the past year. In those Anglophone parts of the country, separatists threatened people so they wouldn't cast their ballots. Several buildings were burned and 2 armed men were killed by the military. But Africa's longest reigning leader described the election as peaceful. Will a win for President Biya exacerbate tensions? For more, here's Randolph Nogle.
An entire generation in Cameroon has known only one leader, Paul Biya, the man who ushered a multi-party system into Cameroon's democracy in the 1990s and has since won 4 elections. The last one in 2011, in which he won 78% of the vote, was seen as flawed by observers and the opposition. Now it appears that he'll win a 5th, but the results from Sunday's presidential vote haven't yet been released. Facing him is a largely fractured opposition. 8 other contenders were on the ballot. One of them has come out and claimed victory without providing any numbers as proof.
J'ai reçu du peuple camerounais un mandat clair que j'entends défendre fermement jusqu'au bout.
Biya's government has said it will take measures against Maurice Kamto for illegally preempting the official result with his announcement. 2 observer missions have declared the elections fair. But there are still concerns of ballot tampering in the 15 days between the election and the deadline for results.
It's inevitable. Fraud is inevitable. It's something that is inherent in Cameroon. We are used to fraud. When they say it takes 15 days to come up with the result of an election, then it's obvious there is fraud.
Like the results, Sunday's voter turnout is also unknown, but it's widely expected to have been low in the country's English-speaking southwest and northwest. Regions where campaigns and election observers dared not go because of recent unrest. Separatist rebels have claimed both regions, naming their new state Ambazonia. But a heavy security presence was deployed to ensure the vote was held and that the rebels, also known as the Amba Boys, couldn't enforce a boycott of the vote on residents. But violence on election day is believed to have deterred voters. The conflict started 2 years ago when protests organized by teachers and lawyers turned violent. Many in Cameroon's Anglophone minority accused the majority Francophone government of discrimination. A heavy security crackdown ensued, and a rebel movement took up arms.
And we are ready. We are waiting for the La Republic.
Both sides have been accused of human rights abuses. Amnesty International says 400 civilians have been killed so far this year, and tens of thousands of people have been displaced throughout the conflict, something that has complicated voting for many.
There's a panic around the people because security cannot be anywhere at any time. So that is why we are uncertain of the future. We don't know what may happen. So that is why it brings fear in the hearts of people.
The separatists are not the only threat Cameroon's government faces. The Boko Haram terror group has launched a number of attacks along the northern border with Nigeria. President Biya, during the campaign, commended people there for their resilience in his only campaign event in which he was present. Win or lose, many will likely continue to question whether Paul Biya, who's 85, has what it takes to lead a fight against multiple security threats, a secessionist movement, and endemic poverty. Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
I'm joined now from Buea by lawyer Akbor Anyor Nkongo. He's the director of the Center for Human Rights and Democracy in Africa. Good to have you on the program once more. So we have this guy, Maurice Kamto, saying he won, even though no official results have been out. Tell me why.
I think he has announced that he won the elections because he's probably had representatives from most of the polling stations, and his representatives have sent him the results, and he believes in the results that his representatives have said. You know, the Electoral Code also makes provision, I think, in its Article 113 to the effect that immediately the elections are completed, the votes can be announced. It's true that also that it's the Constitutional Council that is that has the obligation, that has the right to announce the final results and to proclaim who won the elections or not. But don't what Kamto did, you look at it within the ambit of the history of this country and the fact that elections are always more often than not rigged in favor of the incumbent. And Kamto felt that it was necessary for him to announce, to preempt any rigging that would take place by the incumbent. And it's unfortunate also that I think those in government, they are the ones who are crying foul. They are talking about the respect of the Constitution, the respect of the electoral law. These are people who have never respected the laws of this country. I give you an example. The president of the Senate, Mr. Nyadji Marcel, voted in France, in Paris. I don't believe that he registered there. I don't think that because he went for medical treatment. So did he register there, and why did they allow him to vote? They have been violating the electoral law. They've been violating the constitution of this country. So I mean, I don't think that they have the moral authority to cry foul.
That's interesting. Certainly, you make a good point, right? And you talk about the history and you talk about the context. But with all of that in mind, isn't it more of a reason not to jump the gun, given how divided the country is right now? We saw security forces commit atrocities, Ambazonian separatists committing atrocities as well. There's a fever in the country right now with regards the divide between Anglophones and Francophones, right? And we have the AU saying it was a free and fair election. There are 7,000 electoral observers. With all of that in mind, don't you want it to play out and have third parties verify rather than potentially trigger conflict? Because if one side claims a win before the full count, the other side's going to become antagonistic and so forth. So maybe, is there a possibility that Kamto's being reckless here?
You see, electioneering is a process that starts with registration, that starts with the whole campaign finance, the use of public media, and culminates in voting. Electioneering is not just voting. So the observers might say the elections were free and fair. Might be the elections on the voting day, but was the process free and fair? That is another question. Yes, there is tension in the country. Yes, we have an armed struggle going on in the southern Cameroon, that is southwest and the northwest regions. Yes, we have a divided country. Yes, we have a country. Most people feel that it's time, after 36 years of dictatorship or one-man rule, it's time for Mr. Biya to gracefully surrender power to somebody else. If Kamto is the one who won the elections, then he should gracefully surrender. I understand the fact that there's tension in the country and that it would be prudent for us to wait for the Constitutional Council to announce a result before any of the candidates make such a declaration. But these things are not taken in isolation. You know, we need to look at the context in which Cameroon is situated. We need to look at the history. We need to see how the government has been manipulating public opinion. I followed the Minister of Communication on TV. Clearly, from his analysis, he indirectly said that the president, that Mr. Biya, had also won. So I don't know why we're making a fuss out of this. We remember what happened in the 1992 elections, that Frundi clearly won the election, but the Supreme Court, sitting for the Constitutional Council, manipulated and doctored the results, and the president of the Constitutional Supreme Court said his hands were tied, and he announced the result that Mr. Biya has won. So we have to look at what Professor Kamto did from a very holistic angle. We don't just have to say what he did to look at it in isolation. If we look at it in isolation, then we might say what he did was not right. But if we look at it from the big picture, from the history of the country, and from the way elections results are doctored, are rigged to suit the incumbent, then I mean we might think that he has a right to say what he did.
Once the final count comes out and Kamto wins, would you be celebrating?
Well, I think everybody who likes Cameroon, everybody who is a friend of Cameroon, would celebrate for us to have a new president, would celebrate new leadership, because new leadership will bring new dynamism. It would also contribute in finding a solution to the crisis affecting the Southwest and the Northwest region. It would build confidence. It would create an enabling environment whereby the internally displaced persons could return to their homes, whereby the refugees could come back. It would create an enabling environment. And I expect the new president to compensate the IDPs, to compensate the refugees, to apologize to the Southern Cameroonians for the extrajudicial killings, for the more than 1,000 of them in detention. So I think it would create a conducive environment. It would save the country from a civil war. To me, that is why I'm praying that we have a new president. I don't have any problem with Mr. Biya. I don't hate Mr. Biya personally, but I think that for those who love this country, for the sake of the unity of this country, for the sake of peace, for the sake of our brothers who have been killed, for the sake of our brothers who are in jail, for the sake of those who are in exile, for the sake of those who have been blacklisted from coming to this country, we need a change. We need a change of leadership. With that, I think we can now start a very and negotiation to solution to the crisis.
Same question, different angle. If President Biya is announced, if the incumbent is announced as the next president for his 7th term, would you accept it?
Well, I am a Democrat, okay? If it's announced that Mr. Biya won the election, I would accept it. Okay, I am not somebody who wants to circumvent the democratic process. If it's proven that Mr. Biya wins, that's the beauty of democracy. You might not like the candidate, but if the candidate wins, you have to accept the result. And if it is announced that Mr. Biya wins, and if it's proven beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. Biya wins, then we have to respect the result. We have to support the candidate, but also we have to remind the candidate, the president, that he would have to find a solution to the crisis. He would have to create an enabling environment for us to be able to find a long-lasting solution. He would have to address the 57 years of marginalization, of oppression of the people of Southern Cameroon. He would need to go beyond just working with the same zealots and extremists in his government who think that a solution can be found only through the use of force. But he would have to involve moderates in his government, those who believe that a peaceful solution, dialogue would be the panacea in resolving this crisis.
Understood. Akbar in Congo, we look forward to getting those final results, and we look forward to having you on the program again in the future. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, how will India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi deal with the country's farmers' crisis? Until then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.